Hello! Once again, as always, this is by no means professional at all. I may stutter, I may slur, it's all done in one take. It's merely a story that I have not written but I enjoy very much and wish to share on this YouTube's platform. So without further ado, John dies at the end. Chapter 16. Shit Narnia. There was a period not unlike the half-waking moments before snooze alarms. A timeless, restless void that could have been a second and could have been 10,000 years. I felt air on my face, a rushing wind that pummeled me. I could not see, realized my eyes were closed, and pried them open. My vision immediately went blurry, air blowing the fluids from my eyeballs. I felt like I was falling. I focused my eyes and saw the ground, way down there, hundreds of feet, lush green grass and tiny pale shapes that could have been people, little dots that seemed to grow almost imperceptibly. Wait a second. I am falling. Holy shit. I started flailing my arms, hoping I somehow had the ability to fly in this world. It was no good. I fell and fell for what seemed like an irrationally long time, and then I wasn't falling. Instead, I was tangled up in something soft and springy like cheesecloth, bouncing twice before landing once and for all. I lay there for a moment, and in some kind of netting, dumbfounded, a split second before Molly's ass landed right on my face. I struggled to sit up, saw that I was hanging in a piece of cloth the size of a house, suspended high in the air. Above me, a dozen wingless flying creatures the size of people were keeping it suspended with ropes. Angels, I thought. I've gone to heaven and I'm being carried on a tarp hefted by angels. This wasn't what I was taught to expect in Sunday school, but things are never the way you learn them in the classroom. The cloth convulsed and tossed me again into the air for a dizzying second. John had landed. We were going down, lower down. I peered through the translucent fabric, like looking through pantyhose. I thought I saw a crowd down there, a flesh-colored sea with a space in the middle. I was half expecting to find gates of carved pearl and a judge waiting for me, half expected the crowd down there to descend on me, douse me in drawn butter, and eat me alive. We went down and down and down, the air getting warmer and the wind getting calmer. We finally hit the ground with a jolt. I rolled and flailed in the netting, got on my feet, then fell back on my ass. I got a good look at the beasts carrying the tarp. They were sort of humpbacked men, emitting a growling noise until the moment they landed. They were naked, with penises I worked hard not to notice, but they wore loose hoods that covered their heads and draped down over their chests. One of the men walked near, penis flopping with each step. He extended a hand to help me up. I observed that he did not in fact have a humped back, but instead seemed to have some kind of apparatus that was riding on his back with straps made of hard, jointed plastic or something like that. I let the naked man, hairy as Robin Williams, help me up, and then I withdrew my hand as quickly as possible. He stood back and joined the humpbacks who were forming a loose circle around me and John and the dog. Beyond them, I saw the crowd. There were maybe 100 people standing around, every one of them wearing hoods, every one of them otherwise naked. I observed with some dismay that a large percentage of them were elderly. I noticed that one group of them were holding up a large, colorful banner, but I could not make out what it was on it. I said to John, "Okay, so, you see Amy here?" John said, "Dunno." He scanned the hooded nakedness around us and said, "You know what this is, right? We're in an alternate universe and this is Eyes Wide Shut world." The crowd stared at us in silence. Molly sniffed the air. It was cool here, maybe in the high 50s, a mild winter. The grass around us was still green and soft, and the landscape was made of the same low hills that Undisclosed was built on, spilling out around us like a wrinkled green rug. My head throbbed from getting clubbed earlier. I said, "I wonder what they're expecting. Are we supposed to fight each other to the death?" In Eyes Wide Shut world, we'll be lucky if that's all it is. From the crowd, a large man emerged, no hood, wearing a pinstripe suit. Or, should I say, he was wearing an imitation of a pinstripe suit. It was black with pinstripes that seemed to be about a quarter-inch wide, and a short, fat red tie that only hung down about 6 inches from his neck. He spread his arms. "Gentlemen, welcome." His face was human, but off. A Michael Jackson sort of face. I had seen it on my television. The man wore no hood, but he was wearing something like a latex mask. Better than Halloween quality, but still obvious it wasn't his real face. I could see the seams under his ear. The ear was part of the mask, and the hair was unmistakably a wig. I said, "Where's the girl?" The man hesitated, seemed confused. I said, "Red hair?" She's missing a hand? Ah, he said. Amy Sullivan. She is very safe. Come. The man gestured in one direction, and the crowd stepped aside to make a clear path for us. One of the humpbacked men who had carried our net did something with his hands, and the apparatus on his back jumped off on its own. It crawled around on the ground on 6 legs. It was a living creature, I realized, and it reminded me somewhat of a giant beetle. It munched on some grass and softly farted through slits in its hindquarters that I theorized had been supplying the propulsion to keep us aloft. The large man walked us through the path, followed by the naked crowd. I saw the large banner again, and this time could make out the image. It was a cartoonish painting of me, depicted as a muscular warrior with a gushing head wound. Molly at my feet, teeth bared, with the flesh of some slain enemy in her jaws. John was shown bearing a fistful of flame, with an enormously exaggerated crotch bulge. The large man turned and said, "A select few interested parties were allowed to come and observe your arrival. We asked the ones who came to be considerate. Our style of dress here is quite different than what you are used to. We did not want to cause you stress, so we thought removing the garments would lessen your discomfort. I believe some of the styles would be quite unnerving for a person from your world." We were led down the gauntlet of nudity. 2 walls of flaccid penises and graying pubic hair and bare legs webbed the blue veins. One tall man, I noticed, was awkwardly trying to hide a gigantic erection. Not even eyes, however, were visible behind the slits in the hoods that draped over their shoulders. "Why the hoods?" asked John. The large man didn't hear or didn't feel like replying. We came upon a grassy hill, which I for some reason thought would have been the same hill the Sullivan house rested on back on the real Earth. The hill turned out to have a door on the side, a sort of underground building built into the hill. It occurred to me that all of their buildings may have been built this way, leaving the landscape itself uninterrupted. The door slid to the side, and as we passed through I saw the door and the mechanism seeming to be made of carved stone, something dense and smooth, maybe granite. I don't know my rocks. We were led down a hall lined with more hooded nudists. The overhead lights were cut into the ceiling, and seemed to emit a perfectly natural sunlight that was somehow soothing. As we passed, the observers nodded and leaned to each other and gestured, noticing things and pointing them out to their neighbor. What was missing from this was any sound. No whispering. No grunting. They must have had specific instructions from the big guy not to speak, and I thought maybe they spoke a foreign language when among themselves. We entered a large, round ballroom-type chamber, and John and I stopped dead cold. In the center of the room was an enormous, flaming golden statue. And I don't mean it was painted gold either. It was gold. A 20-foot-tall representation of the image on the banner outside. John and me and Molly, our backs to each other, ready for battle. A fountain of flame poured up from the center of the statue, so each of our backs were to it. I said, "I think they were expecting us." John nodded. "Look at that. It looks like the flame is shooting out of our asses." We were led down a hall and into a small, round room with white walls that had a rough texture like stucco. The only furniture was 2 large, elaborately curved chairs that seemed to be made of uncut wood, as if the branches of a tree had grown into 4 legs and arms and a back, purely by chance. On the floor was a pillow, presumably for the dog. The man gestured to the chairs, and we sat, dog included. The man walked past me and stopped, observing the blood running down my neck. "Your injury. Let us tend to it." He looked out through the open doorway and silently gestured to someone out there. "Our world," he said, "is far more advanced than yours, for reasons you'll understand shortly." A thin, bony, naked woman entered the room, carrying 2 small white kittens. She sat one of the fluffy cats in my lap and stuffed the other down my shirt. She turned and left. "There," said the large man. "The kittens will make your sad go away." The man looked back at the doorway we came through and, on its own, a door slid from the wall and clicked closed. The operation of the door was a whisper, quiet thump. The inside of the door carried the same rough white texture, and the lines of the door disappeared once it was closed. I suddenly had the claustrophobia a bird fetus must feel at the moment before kicking its way out of the egg. The kitten scratched my chest, and I opened my shirt to let it flop out onto my lap. The man came around to the wall in front of us, an excited expression on his face that didn't translate through his mask that well. "I suppose you are wondering where you are." I raised my hand. "I'm going to say that we're in an alternate universe of some kind." "That is correct. Do not think of it as a physical location. Think of it as another possible arrangement of the atoms in your universe to form something else. Today's cloud is tomorrow's puddle." "Yes," I said. "That's much clearer." Undaunted, the large man said, "But to perceive one world, and then the next, requires a point of concentration, or A wormhole? Said John, hoping to usher the guy along. I am unfamiliar with the term. Tell me, what was it like, passing through? I shrugged and said, I wasn't really paying attention. John said, Yeah, it wasn't that great. The man waited for quite a long time for us to add something, but we did not. Finally, he said, We have been waiting your coming, as you can see. We have worked for many years, suffered many tragic setbacks, in order to find and communicate with another plane such as yours. Some thought that travel from one to another was impossible, but here you are. Your world, you see, is a sort of twin to ours, an offspring born of the same litter. The man turned and gestured to the wall, and the letter Y appeared in black. Suddenly I realized that the texture on the walls was moving and twitching, and that it was not stucco or plaster. They were insects, clustered together to cover the entire surface of the room. They were the size of dimes and seemed to have the chameleon's ability to change the color of their shells at will. Up until here, said the man, pointing to the space where the trunk of the Y split into two branches, our histories were identical. This spot represents the year 1864, as you would call it, or year minus 62, as we would call it. There was a man named Adam Rooney from Tennessee, in your world and ours. In your world, he was killed at age 17 during the Civil War, gored while trying to crossbreed a bull and a Clydesdale. In our world, the man survived. The ranks of bugs on the wall changed colors again, turning shades of brown and tan and black, forming a rough portrait of an older man, smoking a pipe and looking out at the viewer through thick eyeglasses. He had a white Colonel Sanders beard. Mr. Rooney, he continued, was a genius. He went on to perform experiments with what he would call bestiology. Yes, said John, people from our south are into that as well. The large man skipped a beat and continued. This is the art of transforming naturally occurring life into forms that can be used by man to better the world. By 1881, Rooney had a self-shearing sheep and a species of snake that could harvest corn. By 1890, his group had an insectile flying machine. In 1902, or year minus 24 in our terms, he created a primitive thinking machine from the brain of a pig. The image behind the man changed to a colored depiction of several men standing over a vat of fluid. Inside it floated a twisted and deformed mass of what looked like brain tissue, about the size of a small dog. The men were wearing lab coats. I have studied your world for the last decade, your language, your history. It is astonishing to me that you went to such unending lengths to build computation machines from metal and silicon switches when you have much more efficient versions inside your own skulls. Did this not occur to your scientists? By your year, 1922, we had self-feeding, self-healing, self-growing, and self-modifying computers, organic ones, that were approximately 10 times as powerful as what you are using now in your world. The image shifted again, and this time a group of a dozen very proud-looking men were standing in front of a monster. The thing rose up behind them, no longer confined to a tank of fluid. It looked like a tree carved out of whale guts. It was a hideous twist of meat and fibers and strands that unspooled here and there like spider web. It stood as tall as a small tree, maybe twice as high as a man. I got a dizzy spell, closed my eyes. A concussion? I clutched the kittens, one of them meowed. In just a few moments, I found I really did feel better. In 1926, or what we know as Year 1, Mr. Rooney passed away. But something miraculous happened with the greatest of Mr. Rooney's creations, the computation machine that had aided him with all of his other creations. On the very day Mr. Rooney passed, his creation became sentient. The large man gave a practiced pause in the middle of what I assumed was a prepared speech. This was where he was supposed to gasp in surprise, I guess. I nodded politely. It gave a name to itself, said the large man, and expressed desires and emotions. This was an astonishing surprise. This creation carried on Rooney's work, and conformed all of living nature to urge forth the advancement of mankind. Suddenly our vision was flooded with a view of an open, muddy field. The entire room had switched to a full-motion image, a panoramic view that made me dizzy. The image zoomed into a long trench, like those used in World War I. The trench extended off in both directions, and standing along the lip of the trench were men and women and children, lined up shoulder to shoulder. Some of the children were crying. Everyone was wearing clothes that were streaked brown and white, and seemed to be made entirely of thin strips wrapped around and around their bodies. I thought for a moment they were all wrapped in bacon. The people seemed to obey an unheard command, and all stepped down into the muddy trench. The children had to be dragged down against their will. Suddenly, puffs of dirt burst up from the ground around their bare feet, and then the trench was filling with a dark flood. A close-in shot revealed the flood to be thousands and thousands of spiders, sharp bodies and yellow stripes, bred for war. There was a chorus of screams. The spiders swarmed over the victims, burrowing into skin and through ragged holes and muscle. I saw a spider burst out of one man's eye, a half-dozen tearing themselves out of holes in another man's back, emerging from his guts and carrying loops of intestine with them. Blood sprayed, limbs fell to the ground, bones were torn from legs and rib cages. And then, the spiders were gone. The view lingered on the torn and bloodied victims, and I realized that none had been killed. Instead, the spiders had left them in piles, hundreds and hundreds in a screaming, red, writhing mass, everyone missing limbs and baseball-sized chunks of flesh. Men left blind and deaf and unable to move. No one came to their aid. The shot pulled back to reveal the trench stretched for miles in both directions, and the entire length now ran pink like a highway on a road map, the screams swelling up and up. Then it was gone. The white room was back and the large man was standing before us, beaming with what I was pretty sure was pride. He said, "There are always those who resist progress." My eyes bounced around the room, and I again had that suffocating feeling. No door. Hell, I couldn't even point to the spot where the door had been. I looked over at John, and he seemed to be trying to figure out if his chair could be used as a weapon. It looked rooted to the floor. "Now," said the larger man, "knowing your world, this part may be a difficulty for you. Let me give you an example. In your world, as in mine, it is not considered bad to take and use, without permission, an object that another man is currently using or depending on." "Yes, in our world we call this stealing," said John, with some impatience. "It is considered a greater crime, though to unleash killer spiders on an unarmed crowd, we call that arachnicide." "But what if the object that you stole would later have injured or killed that man? Then stealing it would be saving his life. Or what if he had intended to use it as a weapon later, against an innocent person? And what if that weapon would have killed the child who would later grow up to cure a terrible disease?" John, who had settled right into this conversation, scratched his chin, shrugged, and said, "Well, you don't know, but you do the best you—" "What if you could know?" said the large man. "You already, in your world, have machines that can compute and forecast outcomes and scenarios, that can look at air temperatures and wind patterns and predict the weather ahead of time. What if there was a thinking machine, an entity so powerful that it could foresee the outcome of any action? In it, you would have the ultimate morality, the true ability to know which path was the correct one." I said, "Well, we have people in our world who believe in a—" "I'm not talking about a belief. What I am talking about exists here and now, in our world. It is something you can touch and see and smell. Something real." The lower half of his mask twisted, and I thought he was smiling. "Follow me." Mercifully, the door opened. I had the urge to knock the guy down and make a run for it, but where would we go? It was impossible to be farther from home than we were. Our home, in fact, literally did not exist at that moment. The large man led us back into the hallway, now empty of people. He led us to another stone doorway, and when the door slid back, we were greeted with a shaft, about as wide as the shaft for a big service elevator. It led straight down, a row of lights vanishing into darkness hundreds of feet below. Thin, black legs appeared over the edge, each as long as my body. I jumped back and heard a squeal as I stepped on a kitten, which was apparently following me. The large man put a calming hand on my shoulder. The legs belonged to a spider the size of a van. It crawled up the opposite wall of the shaft, its mass neatly filling the entire space as if it were made for it. Its huge, bulbous back was facing us. A split formed in the spider's body and it opened, revealing a rather clean interior that was a milky white. A light even blinked on in the cavity. The large man walked inside the spider. There was room to stand up in there. He welcomed us inside, and I decided on the spot that I wasn't doing it. Never, ever, ever. But John went in, and then the dog, and then fluffy kittens, and at that point I really didn't have a choice. I got inside the thing, and the cavity closed and sealed us in. After a moment, the spider jolted, and we were riding down. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" asked John. That if Franz Kafka were in his head would explode? Oh shit. That if Franz Kafka were here, his head would explode? Actually, yeah. The large man, intent on continuing the tour, said, "We are on the verge of entering year 77 of our new era, the era of guidance and enlightenment. We have made great strides. There is little that we need that we cannot extract from the very living energy that is the most powerful force the universe produces. Life is the energy that controls all other energies. Living man can split the atom and travel the stars and, soon, move from reality to reality. but it is life that is the engine at the center of all. We rode for several more minutes, then, much to my relief, the spider opened and led us out into a large open room that had a dome shaped like the last one, and like the underground complex we had left in our world. John nudged me and pointed to a row of windows above us, like the observation areas seen in some hospital operating rooms. Behind it were naked hooded figures, a crowd. I wondered if they had paid for tickets to this. Many people in the front row of the observation deck were pressed nakedly against the glass, producing a squished scrotum effect that I knew I would see in my nightmares. Just below the windows were clear vats, like man-sized mason jars. They lined the walls and each were filled with deep red fluid. I was about to ask the man what the fluid was, but then he disappeared through another door and urged us to follow. We went through a hall, past another door. Then the stench hit me. Sulfur. A smell so strong it was a solid thing in my lungs. We went through and came out into a catwalk, suspended in a dark space that seemed to go forever in each direction. I stepped out and stopped. I craned my neck, looking up and up and up, then looked down. I could see neither the top nor the bottom of the thing that grew before me. Oh, dear Jesus. "Gentlemen," said the large man, "you are seeing what only a select few have seen. You are looking at the ultimate manifestation of Mr. Rooney's creation, which now stands as the absolute wisdom and strength in all of existence. John, David, meet Korok." I hesitate in the telling of my story at this point. When I try to bring up an image of Korok in my mind, I see only the glob of stuff that collects in the kitchen drain, the mass of grease and hair washed by years of filthy dishwater. It was like someone collected all the drain slime in the world and knitted it into something the size of a Statue of Liberty, then brought it to life with the psychotic energy that fuels lynch mobs. There was so much to Korok that it was impossible to see it, a jumbled mess of exposed organs and fibers and dangling club-ended limbs, of dripping orifices and slimy orbs and dark black bulbs with colors that moved on the surface like the rainbows in an oil slick. Every inch of it was moving. I stared and stared and stared, found my brain couldn't contain it all. And then, in my head, I heard the high-pitched, cackling laughter of a child. "Welcome," said the alien voice in my head. It sounded like a toddler. "Your wiener is even smaller in person." It giggled. I thought, is this Korok? "With a tiny change in your brain chemistry, I can make you a child molester." "What do you want?" I asked in my head. "Not big black cocks, so we don't have that in common." A long, loud laugh that rattled my bones. I glanced over and saw that John and the large man were talking to each other, oblivious to me. I thought, get out of my head. You're not worth talking to. "I am Korok. In the mountains of Uruguay, a goat gets its hoof caught in a post hole, and the bone snaps like a twig. The splinter juts from its skin, blood spraying onto white fur. It has stuck like that for 3 days. Finally, a wolf mother comes along, carrying her pup in her jaws. She lets the pup feed off the goat, gnawing bits of fur and skin and tearing at muscle. The goat feels it and screams, and there is pain in pain, and neither the goat nor the wolf nor the pup understand their place in the machine. I stand above all and call them fags. I am Korok." "Fuck off. You're just something they grew, a big fucked up mess. You look like you were made by a committee." Long, loud, childish laughter. "David Wong, son of an insane prostitute and a mentally challenged anyway salesman. There are worlds and worlds and worlds, an infinity you cannot grasp. You could travel from one to another, and find me in thousands upon thousands, spreading like stars in the sky from reality to reality. They invite me in. They give birth to me. And soon, yours will do the same. Men are working tirelessly toward it. They bring me into their world because they always want what only I can give. In this place, 7 billion men bear my mark, and of limitless infinity of worlds, I rule over almost half of them." And then I saw, for the first time, the way the darkness in the chamber moved. The black shapes, the shadow men, the little slips of nothing swirled in this place, covering Korok like smoke from an oil fire. They moved over and through him, in and out of every orifice and fold of his skin. His dark disciples. I heard a sound and realized I was being talked to from the outside. I turned to face the large man. "The greatest good for the greatest people," he was finishing. "So you understand. When Korok judges, there is no question. All of the human minds who have ever lived in the history, all of your thinkers and writers and philosophers and teachers, could not equal even one node of Korok's neural web. We have learned this the hard way." I looked down at Molly, then sort of nudged her belly with my foot. Try to loosen that shit up in there. The large man said, 20 years ago, Korok foretold your coming. Korok showed us the way to your world. Open lines of communication. We could not cross to your plane ourselves. We tried. Oh, did we. You see, when a man is transferred to the other plane, the body arrives, but only the body, walking aimless like a cow. The person becomes detached in the transition. But nonetheless, we worked tirelessly to create in your world what we have here, in preparation for the glorious day when we could overcome these obstacles and set our own feet on the land and see our sun with our own eyes. The large man put a hand on my shoulder. I shuddered. Your friend, the girl, Amy Sullivan. She is known because she was the first step. She was successfully transported from one location to another in your world, without passing anywhere in between and without harm. Your people did this. Korok showed them the way. With that, we knew we were close, could see the faint glow of the sun signaling a new dawn. Gentlemen, with your arrival, that dawn has come. What one man can do, other men can do, and you will show us the way to pass this from world to world. It is the ultimate good, and it is impossible for it to be otherwise. Korok told us you would be honored, and well you should be. The man craned his neck, looking up in the darkness. He said, You cannot begin to calculate the wisdom, the continued melding of a billion geniuses. You see, in our world, whenever a man is born with special wisdom and intelligence, he shares his wisdom with Korok, so that Korok may be greater. Watch. A thin structure emerged from the wall, about 2 stories above us. It tilted down and seemed to have no steps, as if it were a chute of some kind. An orifice that seemed to have something like a beak opened at Korok at the end of the chute. A fat man came tumbling down the slide, his limbs flailing. He wore the same brown strips of clothing I saw in the video of the bug room. Korok snatched the man into his beak, crunching his bones in a wet red spray. I heard a high-pitched laugh in my head. Bacon. In front of me, a slit formed in Korok and opened wide. An electric blue eye the size of a movie screen was peering out at me. A thin, black, vertical pupil. I ran. I sprinted back through the door, off the catwalk, back through the other doors and down the hall and back into the sound room with the naked viewing gallery. People were still up there, rustling and gesturing now, excited to see the crazy happenings of the strange visitor. The door out of the room slid shut before I got to it, and I slapped it ineffectively with my palms. The large man called out from behind me, and I spun, breathing hard. He held out his hands in a calming gesture. We understand. I assure you we do. I've observed you. You know I have. And you have seen some of our work. We are advancing into your world with astonishing speed. Our workers prepare day and night. There are legions on our side there, and soon all of your turmoil and unrest and confusion will vanish under the soft hand of Korok. A kitten put its paw on my foot. I punted it across the room. Just watch, said the large man. We can perform what in your world would be a miracle. Observe. The floor under my feet vanished, or, I should say, it turned transparent like glass. Under me were dozens of terrified, upturned faces. They were uncovered and looked just like people from my world. And right then, somehow I knew that under the large man's mask I would find something quite different than the wide eyes and unshaven faces I saw now below me. I was looking down at what was a sort of prison chamber on the floor below. Each person down there trapped in a hexagonal glass section not much wider than their shoulders. A massive crystalline beehive. The floor wasn't quite soundproof because I could faintly hear their screams. I saw John step through the door and stop in revulsion. The large man motioned with his hand, and one hexagon rose silently up from the floor. Inside was a man in his 30s with curly black hair, held there in the glass booth like a museum exhibit. I heard the hiss of the same mechanism raising other pods, and soon we were surrounded by 6 of the hexagonal glass booths. The large man said, We command the cell itself, at will. We can turn muscle to bone and back, skin to carapace, fingers into claws, and we can do it in any way we choose. Watch. The curly-haired man stared at us in terror, his palms flat against the glass. Then he screamed. It wasn't immediately apparent what was wrong with him, but then I saw one of his knees bend backward, splitting the flesh. The other one did the same, his legs extending upward, jutting as high as his shoulders. His skin melted from his face and hardened into a small insectile head and skin that became gray and notched like alligator hide. Molly whined and trotted off into a corner. I wasn't sure if she was terrified or if the burritos were finally getting to her. I pivoted around the room and was now looking at 6 of the beasts that had chased us up here. The beasts from Jim's basement. Beastments. The glass walls lowered, and the creatures were standing open in the room now, facing us in a circle. And once the bodies have been changed, said the large man, the brains have changed. Memories are only arrangements of neural connections, and once altered, they can no longer resist our commands than a twig can resist the flame. He studied me from behind his rubbery face, said, "As you know." I moved toward the large man, intending to take him hostage and negotiate an exit from this place. I reached for the gun in my pocket, realized I didn't have it, and pulled out the spare magazine instead. I threw it at the large man, and he flinched as it bounced off his chest. I lunged. They moved so fast. In a blur, I had a bunch of talons clamped around my neck and arms and legs. 2 of the monsters were on me, holding me still as a Ken doll. The large man looked downcast, I suppose. The mask sagged a little. He said, "What we have for you to do is so important. Korak has seen the outcome. It will happen if you resist, or if you do not resist. And all that will change is your personal well-being. It is for the greater good. Do you not see that?" He almost sounded on the verge of tears, crushed by my tragic inability to grasp the obvious. 2 of the monsters carried me from the room, dragging me backward down the hall. The other 4 descended upon John, and I heard him cursing loudly. The large man followed me, and the door sealed over the sound of John screaming that he was having a seizure, and that they should let him go. I screamed, "Light the dog, John! Light the dog!" But I assumed the doors were just as soundproof from the inside as out. I was hauled into yet another small, round room, accompanied by the large man. The door swept shut behind us, and the 2 creatures turned me loose. I saw we were not alone. There was a small figure huddled against the far wall. Red hair. "Amy!" I ran toward her, and I was smacked in the face by nothing. I fell to the ground and realized I had run into a glass or otherwise transparent barrier that separated the room. Amy looked up at me in dull surprise. She looked to be beyond shock. Large man said, "Our representatives are all over your world. We have been planning this for years, and all of the pieces are in place. It is just a matter of clearing the way, of wiping your world clean. 2 glasses, yours with water, ours with wine. To fill the other with wine, the water must first be spilled. Do you not see that the wine is better?" A door opened on Amy's side of the room, and 2 men came in. They were not naked, far from it. They were dressed in what looked like layers of leather half a foot thick, shoulders bulging with some kind of hard padding. They looked like members of a bomb squad. Between them, they carried a container the size of a 50-gallon drum. It was red and stamped with an enormous yellow warning label captioned in a foreign language that used letters like Elvish. They set the container on the floor and activated a latch. They then turned and ran from the room. Amy stood and pressed herself against the far wall. The top of the container opened and slid aside. I held my breath, eyes bouncing from Amy to the container, waiting to see what would emerge from the dark opening. I ran up and pressed my palms against the glass, screamed her name. I noticed she didn't have a left hand. A single, tiny white insect zipped out of the container, thin and wingless, but flying nonetheless. It streaked through the air and moved toward Amy. She backed away from it, following it with her eyes as it swirled overhead. "It is a miraculous thing," said Large Man. "It has the mind and instincts and urges of a man, only without limbs or nerves or sense organs. It knows only to fly and to breed, and once it finds its host, it will produce 20,000 offspring in a matter of minutes. They grow quickly in the soft tissue of the host, and then they burst forth, each to find new hosts, and so on." I knew that already. The insect buzzed around and around and around. Then it landed on her shoulder, and Amy swatted like a mosquito. I screamed at her again, and she couldn't hear me. Then it was Amy's turn to scream. She was pulling her hand back and looking at it like it had just been impaled on a tack. She shook the hand and rubbed it on the wall, did everything she could to try to dislodge the insect, but it was useless. It had burrowed into her. I banged on the glass with my hands, looking in, helpless. Amy looked at her hand and at me, baffled, not even sure what any of this meant. I spun on Large Man and said, "Undo it. Give her an antidote, insecticide, whatever kills those things." Any such solution would kill her as well. No. This can end only one way. Korak has seen it. I turned back and saw Amy had slid down and was sitting on the floor again, looking hopeless, looking like she expected to wake up at any moment, find herself back in bed. "The future is what it is," said Large Man. "Your people have been poisoned with myths of lone men turning the tide, improbable tales of heroes outrunning explosions with their feet. Such tales are forbidden here. Events are laid forth, and they cannot be turned. There are no heroes, Mr. Wallen. Korak has computed it down to the atom, and we have nothing left to chance. In that moment, the door swung open. A slimy spray of blown flew across the room in a wide arc. John had a plan. If he is to be believed, while I was being hauled into the room with Amy, the 4 beastmen holding John tried to keep him still as he proclaimed seizure and thrashed his limbs about. "Seizure! I'm seizing here!" This caused a commotion up on the observation deck, with the observers not sure what to do with Large Man gone and the trans-dimensional visitor festival spinning quickly out of control. Molly began whining in earnest at that moment, quivering all over. John knew that both of General Valdez's excellent microwave burritos were about to make a reappearance. A door opened and an emergency crew rushed in, 4 hooded women, each carrying a kitten in each hand. More people filed into the room behind them, and John figured they were from the observation deck, and they were using this as an excuse to get a closer look. These people seemed to have some authority, and with a gesture of their hands, the 4 inhuman guards let go of John's arms. He fell to the floor, and immediately the girls piled their kittens on his body and fussed over him. "I must have my medicine!" John shouted to a small, pale man who he guessed was Asian. Neither the man nor anyone else seemed to know what John was saying. "My seizure medicine!" John reached into his pocket, and several of the onlookers jumped back. John pulled out his tobacco and cigarette papers and held them up to show they were not weapons. The group stood and watched in fascination as John sat and brushed the kittens aside. He gathered all of his concentration and went about rolling the one perfect cigarette that could save our universe. He spread the tobacco, rolled, wound up with a cone-shaped tobacco horn that had John cursing in frustration. He tried a second time, almost got it, and then finally a third. Perfect. He glanced at Molly and nodded. Then, with a squeal and a sound like a hard rainfall, Molly let go. A spray of shit ejected from her hindquarters, and in it was a lump that John instantly recognized as half a dog bone that went undigested since it was an unstable ultra-high explosive compound instead of the antlers and fermented cow fur that actual dog biscuits are made of. John lit his perfect cigarette, took a puff, and nodded his thanks to the group. John leapt to his feet. He held out his hands to the group of humans and the 4 monstrosities in the room. He said, "Everybody stand back!" He went to the puddle of feces, grimaced as he fished out the soggy chunk of explosive dog biscuit. He used his pinky finger to dig out a small dent in the half-bone, then lodged the unlit end of the cigarette into it. He set the smoking apparatus onto a dry piece of floor, stood, checked his watch, then looked over at the thin yellow-brown stream that was leaking from the dog. "Molly, it's time to go bye-bye." John picked up the shitting dog, holding her across his chest with both arms, her paws dangling. He sprinted out of the room, screaming, "Get out! Everyone get out! It's gonna blow!" John hefted the dog down the hall, came to the first closed door he could find. He saw no handle on the door and no buttons or controls. He screamed, "Open, you fuck!" and the door slid obediently open. John saw Large Man and saw room imprisoning Amy and saw me looking outraged and decided it was best to turn Molly's ass toward Large Man and hoped she shat on him. She did. I threw my hand in front of my face as warm shit splattered in a wide stream across the room, the dog letting out an agonized yelp. Large Man was surprised by this turn of events and threw himself to the ground. John let Molly go, pulled a Zippo from his pocket, lit it, and flung it at one of the beastmen. The lighter smacked it in the head with a flare of yellow and blue, the thing letting out a howl. John then ran over and administered a hard kick to Large Man's ribs. In a blur, the 2 beastmen were on him, Large Man telling them not to kill him. Everything was under control. As if to specifically contradict this assertion, I noticed a lump of fairly solid feces on the floor from which emerged another cracked piece of our dog biscuit bomb. I grabbed it in my hand, ran and dove and snatched John's lighter from the floor. I saw the group from the hall pushing into the door now, including 4 of the beastmen. They were tossing naked people aside and imposing themselves into the room. I held up the dog turd and flicked the lighter, flame dancing an inch away from the explosive excrement. "There's enough explosive in this poo to collapse this whole cave. Now back the fuck off." Whatever basic English these people knew apparently didn't include these 2 phrases. Nobody moved for a long time. The only sound, the wet, farting mechanism of Molly's digestive system. "Now!" Large Man understood perfectly. He stumbled to his feet and nodded to the beastmen in the door. It occurred to me for the first time that the people here communicated with a sort of telepathy. I would have to make some time later to be fascinated by that. At his inaudible instructions, the room was cleared and the door was shut. Only John and I and Molly were left, alone with Large Man. I turned to the Amy, who was looking at us with eyes squinted in a sort of disgusted, accident-scene curiosity. I said, "Get back! Back against the wall!" John and I didn't need to discuss the plan. We got on the floor, dug out the hunk of dog bone from the poo. We had maybe a quarter of the bone, and we used John's car keys to chip off a tiny hunk the size of a grain of rice. We used some of the dog poo to stick the shard of the glass about 2 inches off the floor. John lit the Zippo, leaned it against the glass so the flame licked the smear of feces. We threw ourselves to the far end of the room and covered our heads. The sound was massive, a sharp pack that was like nails in the eardrums. There was no sound of shattering glass, and I was afraid it had failed. I rose and saw in the clearing smoke that a large, puckered hole had formed in the clear wall, like a hole punched in taffy. Amy ran out and I threw my arms around her. She said, "Where are we? I don't know how—" Later, I turned to Large Man. "If you can't cure her, then you get us out of here. Get us back to our world. We'll find a way." "Gladly. We haven't had long before she hatches," I said, "and let me guess. If she dies, these things come out of her right away, right?" He didn't reply, but I knew I was right. "Okay, so you got some serious motivation to keep her safe, right? Now get us the fuck out of here." John said, "You better hurry, too." 2 rooms away, an inch of ash fell from a rolled cigarette crammed into a poo-smeared dog biscuit. A faint ember of orange light smoldered away at the remaining 2 inches. John said to me, "We have," he thought for a moment, 5 minutes, 13 seconds before biscuit time." I set my watch. I couldn't find the countdown feature, managed to change the date and the time zone both before I got it set, then had to adjust for the time lost. 4:48. We burst out of the door, me with my arm around Large Man's neck, holding a lighter to his cheek. "Nobody move or I'll light his fucking face on fire." I meant it, too. Either they took his threat seriously or Large Man was giving them instructions to back off. We pushed him down the hall and he pointed us to an elevator. 4:12. We climbed inside another giant spider, much to Amy's horror, and took an agonizingly long, slow ride down. Amy was having trouble standing, squeezing her eyes shut and wrapping her arms around her gut. Something's growing in there. Oh, shit. Down and down and down. These people built their skyscrapers upside down. 1:32. Finally, it stopped. We emerged in a round, tube-like hallway. We passed through one thick, round door after another. 58. We entered an enormous chamber, organic machines in clear tubes and huge egg-shaped pods that thrummed with power. I barely noticed any of it. What caught my attention was an enormous creature in the center of the room, shaped something like a huge elephant-sized toad. It squatted in the center of the room, and at the soundless command of Large Man, it opened its enormous mouth wide. Blackness. Inside this creature was the same swirling darkness we saw in the dark column in the mall complex. I squinted, and with concentration I could see a light. Shapes. A room. A moving figure. 36. Large Man stepped aside and pointed us toward the mouth. "Go. Now." I said, "Where does it go? I mean, specifically, where will we come out?" "Theoretically, you should not emerge far from where you went in, but it is difficult to predict." "Amy survived going through. She'll survive going back?" No answer. I stepped up to the dark portal, and as I got closer I realized I could see faintly through it. There did seem to be a small room on the other side, barely visible. I held my breath and stepped into the mouth of the beast, felt again that disconnected, time-lost feeling of an unexpected nap. I was pitched forward and landed on a hardwood floor. I looked up and saw I was in a hallway, turned and saw an open doorway with the V&V Nation posted on it. I stood and realized I was looking through the Irish elevator door in the Sullivan house, only instead of open air I was looking into the toad room I had just come from. The door stood open next to me, as if it had been flung open when I fell in. 22. Molly leapt through and trotted past me. John pushed Amy through it, and as she tumbled onto the floor and instantly went into a fetal position, face twisted in pain. There was a commotion in the other room now. I could see a dozen of the beastmen in there, wreaking havoc. There was a crowd of naked humanity as word would seem to have spread that things were about to go terribly wrong. Large Men had a hold of John as they had apparently either changed their mind or decided to keep him as a souvenir. There was a struggle of flailing arms and kicking teeth, and John grabbed a Large Man's face and came away with a leathery bundle, the man's mask. John froze. The man's back was to me, so I couldn't see what John saw, but the look in John's eyes was a sort of sudden blankness. He didn't scream or puke or react at all. It was like his brain suddenly crashed like windows. I heard footsteps in the hall of the Sullivan house. I spun and saw Robert North, jogging toward me from the stairwell, wearing a long, tan woman's overcoat and an enormous feathery hat. "Hey," I shouted, "we made it. She's sick. She has... Look, give me some, a cross or some holy water, or get the Jesus picture. We'll rub it on her." 11. I turned and saw that the man had snatched the mask from John's hand and was sticking it back on his face. I opened my mouth to scream to John, then wondered if sound would have even traveled through the rift. Then that question was answered when, 0. A deep, heavy thump, like a sonic boom, hammered the world on the other side of the door. The crowd in the room flew into a frenzy. John kicked his way to his feet and ran in my direction. He threw himself through, fell into the hallway. I went to close the door, but North calmly strode over. He reached out a hand, stopped the door, and looked in at Large Man. The two stared at each other across worlds, and the man on the other side mouthed something that seemed like a bitter insult. Though I couldn't hear it, and I knew neither of these men, this meaning was clear. I should have known you were behind this. Amy's skin was bulging and swelling in places. I grabbed her hand and wrapped an arm around her neck and pulled her close, whispered that it was going to be okay, that we would get her fixed up, that... Bang! Suddenly there was warm blood all over me, and a ragged hole appeared in Amy's temple. She went limp in my arms. Standing a few feet away was North. He was holding a little silver gun, a woman's gun, a thread of smoke drifting up from the barrel. Everything inside my head turned black as deep space. I just sat there, shirt and arms flecked with red, just looking at her slack face, her mouth hanging half open, and suddenly her body was being pulled from my arms and North was pulling her, dragging Amy by her feet like a rag doll. John just stood there. He just fucking stood there while all this happened, and I found I had no strength to stand. North wrestled with Amy's body and threw the legs into the doorway, then came around and lifted the shoulders and pushed them through. The crowd in the other world, in the toad room, seemed completely confused by this. A dead body forcing its own way through the portal? But Large Man got it, and he screamed. He screamed so loud I could hear it on the other side, and soon the people around him understood it, and bedlam ensued. It was too late. Amy's body ruptured, spilling out a cloud of the swollen white insects. The flying parasites saw a room full of hosts and poured forth into the naked crowd. A stampede ensued. The rest of Amy's body exploded, bits of blood and bone flying back into the hallway. I heard a metallic tinkling sound like a coin hitting the floor. Just as North slammed the door shut, he opened it again and saw only the undisclosed night sky and a downpour of snow. I started to stand, but North spun and put the pistol on me. "I know what you're thinking," he said. "And you are wrong." He started to say something else, but at that moment John came up behind him and punched him in the kidneys. North arched his back, and suddenly I saw the metallic object I had heard hit the floor. It was a shiny, curved bit of steel, flecked with red, something a surgeon would use to brace a broken spine. I picked up the piece of metal and jabbed it into the wrists of North's gun hand. I felt it go in, punching through skin and popping between two bones of his forearm. North shrieked and the gun clattered to the floor. I grabbed the gun, pointed at North's heart, and watched him melt. Literally, he fell into a puddle of goo, and from it emerged a creature not unlike a jellyfish. A man-o'-war, actually. It floated up, just as we had seen it do a couple of days ago. I squeezed the trigger and sent shot after shot at the thing, chips of wood flecking off the walls. The jellyfish barely noticed. It floated downstairs, and Molly ran barking after it. We never saw it again. There was a puddle of marbled goo on the floor that seemed to be steaming, dissolving, North's leftovers. I took a step forward and yanked open the door, just as North had. A blast of cold air and a dusting of snow blew in. The Sullivans' backyard lay 10 feet below. I was amazed there was still light outside. The whole thing had taken only an hour or so. I sat down on the hardwood floor, sticky dots of blood drying on my face, snowflakes melting on my knees. I couldn't think of a single reason to ever stand up again. We went out to my truck, then remembered that my truck was not at this house, but was at the mall about a mile away. I also had lost my keys at some point, but couldn't remember when. We set out wading through the storm, not sure if a person could walk that far in ankle-deep snow without getting frostbite. We didn't care. We plowed through it, not talking. The afternoon was fast fading to the evening, and what would happen after darkness fell and the shadows grew, we didn't know. A few minutes into our trip, during which we made depressingly little progress and lost feeling in all 20 of our toes, a pickup came grinding up behind us, pulling over just ahead. The driver leaned out, a young guy with a red baseball cap. "Yo," he said, looking over the dusting of snow on our coats. "What's up? Want a ride?" We did. The guy had bucket seats, so John climbed into the bed and rode it out back there. I asked the guy if he was going by the old mall. He said he wasn't. I asked him if he was going south close to my neighborhood. He said he was. I looked around him for Molly, saw she hadn't followed us, and climbed in. We drove. "This be some snowy shit, yo," he said. He had a little triangle of hair under his bottom lip. A soul patch, they call it. I said, "Yep." "It's been hella slick driving in this shit. I'm swerving and getting stuck here and there. All the other drivers be hating on me." I stared at the man. "Are you Fred Durst, or of the band Limp Bizkit?" He smirked and concentrated on the road. Eventually, he said, "Getting hella dark out here. I'm thinking you two don't want to be around here when it gets fully dark, yo. Things be moving and sucking and hating on everything. You know what that? You know that. Wait, shit. But you know that, am I right?" I said, "And you're saying that you're not one of them?" I glanced in the rearview mirror at John, huddled against the wind in the truck bed. I gauged whether or not I could get the wheel away from this guy and shove him out if he should try to eat me or whatever. Fred Durst said, "Well, I ain't Fred Durst. You'll see what you want to see. If John were in here, he'd see somebody else, but the point is there's darkness, yeah. But there's light, and it all balances out. Like them yin and yang fishes, forever biting each other's tails. You know how it be." I studied his blue eyes, said, "Why don't you tell me who you really are before I punch you in the face?" "Yo, I told you. You just didn't listen. But I'm on your side. I've been watching you. In fact, you could say I've been dogging you the whole time." "I have no clue what you're talking about. I'm in no mood to be riddled. Talk straight or shut the fuck up. Are you the good witch? Some kind of angel? Are you Jesus, Fred Durst?" It don't matter. You had a job to do and you did it. Even if you didn't know how you had a job to do or that you were doing it. The blade that cuts out the colon cancer's got an ugly job, right? I guess it's gotta have faith in the surgeon to get it through while its head's being sliced through blood and impacted shit. You know what? Fuck you. All this whole thing is bullshit from top to bottom. I don't know what I believe in, but I know we killed some ugliness back there. And Amy's dead because of it, and she never hurt anybody. She's born, and she gets shit on for 20 years, then she dies for no reason, and I'm still alive, and I should have been killed a long time ago. Hell, I've considered killing me several times as a favor to the world. Fred Durst said, "Yo, I know it's hard. You know there was that boxer back in the 90s, Evander Holyfield. You know what he got to be champion, and then he had that heart disease? Ended his career. Was gonna end his life. He goes to this televangelist, one of those hairspray and polyester dudes. Dude prays and dances over him, and Evander goes back to the doctor. Doctor says he didn't have heart disease no more. Holyfield says it's a miracle, but it turned out they had diagnosed him wrong." That could not have anything less to do with this conversation. You know what you people are like, Fred? You're like the genie from the bottle in those stories. You get a wish, and you wish for $1 million. Then it turns out that $1 million is from an insurance settlement because your best friend is dead. "Yep," said Fred, as if I hadn't spoken at all. "He never had the heart problem. Ain't that something? Turned out it was a smudge on his x-rays or some shit. Do you wish you had died instead of Amy? Like, if you could do it over again?" "Fuck off." "I'm asking the question, yo. Would you do it?" "Yes." "Seriously?" "Yes, of course." "You trade your life for hers. So tomorrow, David Wan is dead. Amy Sullivan is alive." "Stop asking me, Fred. You're making my head hurt." "Okay. I mean, what are you gonna do? Shoot me? Shoot me and resurrect Amy? Or tell me that I've been dead the whole time like in that shitty Bruce Willis movie? Dude, how would you have gone to work every day if you were— Shut up, Fred. We're here." We rolled to a stop and I saw my little house, all the edges rounded under snow. Fred said, "You know what? Don't be too afraid of the dark, yo. You got a watch on your back now, okay, dude?" I had nothing else to say to Fred, so I jumped out and trudged to the sidewalk. I heard the truck pull away and John came up behind me. I got halfway to my door and stopped. Footprints. Fresh prints, leading from the front door around back, the back being where the tool shed was. I had, incredibly, forgotten all about the tool shed and the body within. I went around, following the tracks and finding myself walking slower and slower, shuffling like a man on his way to death row. I go around that corner and everything will change. Everything. I put it off long enough, though. I should have done this 2 nights ago. I rounded the corner and saw the tool shed was unsurprised to see the door was standing wide open. The lock was hanging there, unhooked, and that was no surprise either. I had put the key back in the nail by the kitchen door, and any cop with a warrant could have gotten to it. I went to the door, swung it open, and saw 2 things that could not register in my mind. The first was Amy. She was standing there, alive, arms wrapped around her parka. She was looking down at the corpse on the floor, seeming totally lost, like something absolutely did not compute. I could sympathize with her. She heard me, looked, had an expression of shock that was almost comical. She looked at me, then at the floor, then back at me. I said, "It's me, Amy." She didn't respond. I moved toward her, wanting to squeeze her and take her inside and never let her out of my sight again. She backed away from me, bumping into the shelf full of glass jars. She looked like she was planning her escape. I understood that, too. And that was the second thing. The body on the floor was me. I know my own face pretty well, even blue and frozen like a meat sickle as this one was, nestled among the wrinkled tarp that Amy had thrown open. There was a big, bloody hole right in my heart. John stepped in behind me, and I looked down at the body, and then over at Amy, going through the same tangled path of thought that I had just tread. John said to Amy, "Can I see your feet?" Amy didn't answer. John said, "I know you don't understand this, but you gotta realize that Dave and I saw you get killed not 20 minutes ago, so we got some confusion to sort through." Amy nodded and spoke for the first time, saying, "Okay." She left the shed and sat on the steps at my back door. With the snow pouring down on her, she pulled off her little leather boot and her sock, watched as John picked up her foot, examined it, then had her do the same with the other one. He turned to me and said, "They're clean." And with that, everything snapped into place for me. All the pieces of the puzzle. If you figured it out before now, well, go win a Nobel Prize, Mr. Genius. I said, "They're stocking the world with their own people, with replacements, things that can bridge the world between the spiritual and physical. Korok extending the shadows into our world like fingers, controlling as meat puppets. That's what they were doing in there, making things look like people, monsters under their control. His control, like with Drake. So what happened to the real Drake? Dead?" Amy looked up, eyes wide, understanding where this was going. John said, "Dunno. Maybe they got him and all the other people locked away somewhere, but I doubt it. You know, these replacements, the copies, they gotta have all the memories of the real people, so who knows how they use the originals." I said, "That mark, then, on the foot, that's their mark. And if we had looked on the other Amy, we'd have seen a mark like the symbol for pi. It's probably a brand logo." "So they made an Amy," I said. "Probably when they took her. They made a new Amy and infected her, because they knew if we thought it was her, we would try to bring her back here," we finished together. John said, "And that would have been the end. We would have gotten infected when she, hatched. Then whoever was nearby when, we hatched." "So North knew what he was doing," I said. "When he shot her, he knew it was the right thing, because that wasn't Amy." I stood up, took a step toward the tool shed, and was stopped. I had a redhead squeezing me. Amy was clamped on with all of her strength, her arms around my ribs, her face buried in my shirt. She was crying, saying she was sorry, but I couldn't figure out what for. I ran my hand through her hair and whispered in her ear that it was almost over, that it really was going to be okay this time. I just had to take care of this one last thing. John put a hand on her shoulder and pulled her back toward him. A strange gesture, almost protective, but I was free from her and I stepped toward the tool shed. I heard Amy behind me, saying through choking sobs that she had lost the gun, that she had shot the monster at the mall and ran and lost the thing in the snow, and she called a cab and John shushed her and she went quiet. I moved toward the tool shed, my heart pounding, suddenly feeling lighter than air, a weight lifted from my shoulders. I looked up at the snow pouring down from the night sky and suddenly everything seemed all right. I said, "North knew what he was doing, and I knew what I was doing the other night, when I shot this thing in my tool shed." I reached the little building. John didn't follow, but apparently already knew what I would find. I threw aside the tarp wrapped around the corpse's feet and began tearing at frozen laces on a pair of black leather hiking boots, just like mine. Even a scuffle on the toe, like mine. The body snatchers were insane about their detail. They had to be. I said, "I came home and I found this thing in my yard, this thing that looked just like me, and I ran in and got the gun and I popped him. He probably would have tried to kill me if—" I stopped. I had pulled off the shoe and peeled off the frozen sock, but saw absolutely no mark on the dead foot. I chuckled, out loud for some reason. I dropped the foot and grabbed for the other one, started to pull apart the laces, lost the grip in my numbing fingers, and threw the foot aside, realizing I was fooling myself. I stood there, laughing softly, steam puffing into the darkness, then finally did what I should have done. I went and sat on the step and Amy had vacated. As I passed, John pulled Amy backing off from me, giving me lots of space. I started to take off my right shoe, thought, then went for the left instead. I yanked off the boot and the sock and looked at my big toe. Then I started laughing so hard I could barely breathe. John looked at me with no expression because he already knew. Looked like he had known for some time. Amy hung back behind him, looking nervously between us. I brought up the foot and rubbed at the pi symbol on my toe. as if I could make it come off. I knew, of course, that it never, ever would.